Hi everyone, now you are watching my channel. All the content I create myself, new videos every day, so don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means a lot. Thanks, bye!
Sir, you're sitting in my seat.
Please, this seat doesn't belong to you. Let me be, I upgraded my ticket.
But
He just told you that he upgraded his ticket.
this is my assigned seat.
Are you sure? Because you don't look like you can afford first class. Economy is that way, maybe you're confused? Careful! I've got you. Stand up. That's her assigned seat.
Little girl, go and sit down. This doesn't concern you.
Either you stand up for her to sit, or else.
What are you going to do, little girl? Just Google my name.
The words lingered in the first-class cabin like poison, seeping into every corner of the polished space. Eudora Kingsley stood in the aisle for what felt like forever. Her boarding pass was clutched in her trembling fingers, not from fear, but from the effort it took to stay upright. At 73, her dark skin showed years of resilience. Her tired eyes remained sharp with dignity. This flight from New York to London was not just another trip. It was the journey she had waited 3 years to make, an opportunity to see her daughter Camille, who had moved to the UK for work, and to finally meet her newborn granddaughter, Aria. Eudora had saved for this ticket. First class wasn't something she indulged in often. She could hardly remember the last time she sat anywhere but economy. But her arthritis had worsened over the past year, making simple movements painful. Her knees ached constantly. Her hips protested every step. Her doctor had warned her that a long flight in cramped seating could lead to serious problems, like blood clots or severe joint inflammation. So, she had dipped into her savings, the money she had set aside from her pension, and bought herself a first-class ticket. She had earned it. She deserved it. Now, standing in front of seat 3A, her seat, she stared at the man who refused to move and felt an unexpected surge of humiliation. Grant Holloway didn't even look up when she first approached. He scrolled through his phone, his expensive watch catching the overhead light. His fitted blazer suggested wealth and authority. Everything about him screamed privilege, from his designer shoes to the way he sat with casual ownership of his space. He was on his way to London for what could be the most important business meeting of his career, a high-stakes negotiation with European investors worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He'd spent weeks preparing his pitch, refining every detail, rehearsing his presentation until it was flawless. This deal would cement his position as one of the top dealmakers in the industry. It would prove once again that Grant Holloway was a force to be reckoned with. He'd originally booked an economy seat because company policy required it for international flights. But Grant Holloway didn't fly economy. He never had, and he wasn't about to start now. When he'd arrived at the airport, he tried sweet-talking the gate agent into an upgrade, dropping hints about his status and importance. When that hadn't worked, he'd simply walked onto the plane early and found an empty first-class seat. In his world, rules were suggestions, obstacles were meant to be bypassed, and entitlement was the natural order of things. Seat 3A had been empty when he'd sat down, so he'd claimed it. Simple as that. When Eudora had approached, insisting the seat was hers, Grant had barely registered her as a real problem. People got confused about seat assignments all the time. This elderly woman probably didn't understand how upgrades worked. A firm dismissal would send her on her way, and he could get back to reviewing his presentation materials. When he finally glanced at her, it was with irritation, as if she were merely a minor inconvenience. His dismissal was smooth and practiced, final in its tone. He told her the seat didn't belong to her, that he'd upgraded his ticket, and expected that to be the end of it. Eudora blinked, trying to reconcile what she heard with what she knew. She looked at her boarding pass again. Seat 3A, row 3, seat A, window seat, first class. She wasn't confused or mistaken. This was her seat. She stepped closer, her voice steady despite the pain radiating through her knees, and told him again that this was her assigned seat. That's when Elise Navarro appeared. The flight attendant was in her mid-30s, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek bun. Her uniform was crisp and professional. She wore a smile that seemed trained and not genuine, polite on the surface but empty underneath. She'd been working this flight for 8 years and prided herself on keeping first class running smoothly, on handling conflicts before they escalated, on knowing how to read passengers and give them what they needed. When she saw the commotion, she'd immediately assessed the situation. A well-dressed businessman in his seat, and an elderly black woman standing over him with a boarding pass, claiming it was hers. Elise had made her judgment in seconds. The man looked like he belonged in first class. The woman didn't. It was that simple in her mind. Without asking to see either boarding pass, without following the basic protocol she'd been trained to follow, Elise spoke directly to Eudora. She repeated what Grant had said, that he'd told her he upgraded his ticket, as if his word alone was evidence enough. Then she'd added the words that would haunt her for the rest of her career, asking Eudora if she was sure, suggesting that she didn't look like someone who could afford first class, pointing toward economy and implying that perhaps Eudora was confused. The sting of those words hurt Eudora more than any physical pain. The implication was clear. The judgment was immediate. She didn't look like she belonged here. She didn't seem like someone who could afford first class. And the flight attendant, without verification and without following protocol, had chosen to believe the well-dressed white man instead of her. Eudora felt the eyes of other passengers now. Some looked away quickly, uncomfortable witnesses to something they did not want to acknowledge. Others watched curiously, waiting to see how this would unfold. A few whispered to their seatmates, their voices low but audible enough to sting. Eudora's breath caught in her chest. She had lived through this kind of treatment before, subtle, insidious, wrapped in politeness yet laced with something uglier, assumptions based on her skin color and dismissals based on her appearance. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that today would be different. Her knees buckled slightly. Standing too long, the emotional weight of the confrontation and the arthritis combined to become too much. She reached for the nearest seat to steady herself, her vision blurring. The cabin tilted. Her heart raced. She felt herself starting to fall. That's when a small hand gripped her arm. Zariah Cole was just 11 but moved with the confidence of someone older. Her dark curls formed neat puffs, and her school uniform was pressed and clean. The uniform bore the crest of Whitmore Academy, one of the most prestigious preparatory schools in New York. She had sat quietly in seat 4B, reading a book about space exploration and the mechanics of rocket propulsion, when she noticed the commotion. Zariah came from a world of privilege that most people could only imagine. Her father, Donovan Cole, was the CEO of Sterling Global Bank, one of the largest investment banks in the country. Her mother, Imani Cole, was a renowned civil rights attorney who had built her career defending the defenseless and taking on cases that others considered unwinnable. The Coles lived in a penthouse on the Upper East Side. They had a summer home in Martha's Vineyard and a winter cabin in Aspen. Zariah attended the best schools, wore the finest clothes, and had access to opportunities that money and connections could provide. But Donovan and Imani Cole had raised their daughter with values that wealth couldn't buy and privilege couldn't teach. From the time Zariah could understand language, her father had told her that privilege came with responsibility. That wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to lift others up. That standing by while injustice happened made you complicit in it. He told her stories about his own grandfather who had marched with Dr. King, who had faced down police dogs and fire hoses, who had risked everything so that future generations could have opportunities he'd been denied. Imani had been even more direct in her lessons. She told Zariah about growing up in the rural South, about watching her grandmother being followed in stores, being spoken to with disrespect, being treated as less than human simply because of the color of her skin. She taught Zariah that kindness wasn't about being nice or polite, it was about being just. And justice, real justice, sometimes required confrontation. It required speaking up when others stayed silent. It required putting yourself between the oppressor and the oppressed, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was risky. In the Cole household, kindness was not negotiable. It was the foundation of everything. Donovan had built his career on integrity, on treating people with dignity regardless of their station. Imani had built hers on fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And they had raised Zariah to understand that her privilege was not a trophy to display but a tool to use for good. Zariah was on her way to Le Rosey, an elite boarding school in Switzerland where children of CEOs, diplomats, and royalty received their education. She was traveling alone, something she'd done several times before. Her parents trusted her maturity, her judgment, her ability to navigate the world with both confidence and compassion. They'd taught her to be independent, thoughtful, and above all, courageous. So when Zariah saw this elderly black woman being dismissed, humiliated, and nearly collapsing in the aisle while adults watched and did nothing. Every lesson her parents had ever taught her came flooding back. This wasn't someone else's problem. This was everyone's problem. And if the adults weren't going to do anything about it, then she would. Unlike the adults around her, who watched, whispered, but did nothing, Zariah didn't hesitate. She rushed from her seat and caught Eudora just as the elderly woman's knees gave way, telling her to be careful, that she had her. Her young voice was firm and clear, cutting through the tension in the cabin. She helped Eudora steady herself, her small hands surprisingly strong, determination written across her young face. Then she turned her gaze to Grant Holloway, her eyes sharp and unflinching. There was no fear in her voice when she told him to stand up, that this was Eudora's assigned seat. Just clarity. Just conviction. Grant's response was everything wrong with the world packed into a single sentence. He called her a little girl, dismissed her entirely, told her to sit down and mind her business. He didn't see her courage. He didn't hear her conviction. He saw a child, a black child, daring to challenge him. And he dismissed her the same way he had dismissed Eudora, with casual contempt and absolute certainty that his authority was beyond question. But Zariah didn't flinch. She held his gaze, her small frame planted firmly in the aisle, one hand still supporting Eudora. Her father had taught her that men like Grant relied on intimidation. They expected compliance. They assumed their authority was unquestionable simply because they'd never been questioned before. But Zariah had been raised by a man who commanded boardrooms filled with powerful executives and a woman who faced down injustice in courtrooms. She knew what real power looked like. And it wasn't this. She told Grant that he needed to stand up so Eudora could sit or else. The threat was vague but potent, delivered with a calm certainty that seemed impossible from someone so young. Grant's smirk widened. He leaned back in Eudora's seat, his posture radiating entitlement and condescension. He asked what she was going to do, calling her little girl again, the diminishment intentional and cruel. Then he told her to Google his name, as if his identity alone would be enough to crush her defiance, as if his importance in the world of finance and business would make her realize how foolish she was being. The cabin had gone quiet. Passengers in nearby seats had stopped their conversations, their attention fully on the unfolding scene. A man in seat 2C shifted uncomfortably while his wife whispered something in his ear, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. A woman across the aisle pulled out her phone, her finger hovering over the record button, debating whether to document what was happening. The tension was thick, almost suffocating, pressing down on everyone in that space. Grant expected Zariah to back down. Expected her to apologize, to retreat, to remember her place. That's what children did when adults asserted authority. That's how the world worked in Grant's experience. But Zariah didn't move. She didn't back down. She stood there, this 11-year-old girl in her school uniform, staring down a grown man who had probably intimidated countless people in boardrooms and negotiations. Eudora wanted to speak, to thank this brave child, to insist she didn't need anyone to fight her battles. She'd been fighting her own battles for 73 years. But the words wouldn't come. Her throat was tight, her body exhausted, her legs trembling with the effort of remaining upright. She had spent a lifetime standing up for herself, for her children, for her community. But right now, in this moment, she was grateful that someone, this impossibly brave someone, was standing up for her. The other passengers were watching now, truly watching. A middle-aged black woman in seat 5A had tears forming in her eyes. She knew this feeling intimately. She'd lived it countless times. She'd been followed in stores, questioned in spaces where she belonged, made to feel like an intruder in places she had every right to be. An older white man in seat 1B frowned deeply, clearly uncomfortable but unsure what to do, paralyzed by the social contract that said minding one's business was the polite thing to do. A young couple in seats 3C and 3D exchanged glances, the woman mouthing something to her partner, both of them visibly disturbed by what they were witnessing. The awareness was spreading through the cabin like wildfire. This wasn't just a seating dispute. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding about upgrades and seat assignments. This was something deeper, something uglier, something that everyone recognized even if they couldn't articulate it. Elise stepped forward again, her expression hardening. She looked at Zariah with barely concealed annoyance, the kind adults reserve for children who dare to challenge the established order. She told Zariah she needed to return to her seat, that this was between the adults, her voice taking on that patronizing tone people use when they want to sound reasonable while being anything but. But Zariah cut through the dismissal with a question that landed like a blade. She asked why Elise wasn't checking Grant's ticket. Why she was siding with him without verification. The question was simple, direct, and devastating in its clarity. It hung in the air like an accusation. Because that's exactly what it was. Elise's face flushed red. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, struggling to find words that would justify her actions without admitting her bias. She glanced at Grant, then back at Zariah, then at the growing number of passengers now openly watching the confrontation. The cabin shifted. What had been uncomfortable silence was now charged attention. People were no longer looking away. A man in seat 4C, a black businessman in his 40s wearing an expensive suit and carrying himself with quiet dignity, leaned forward slightly. His voice was low but clear enough for those nearby to hear when he said that the girl had a point. Why hadn't the flight attendant checked Grant's ticket first? The question was rhetorical but pointed, aimed directly at the double standard everyone was witnessing. His companion, a woman in a beautifully embroidered headscarf sitting in seat 4D, nodded slowly. Her expression was a mixture of anger and resignation, the look of someone who had seen this pattern too many times to be surprised but was still hurt by it every single time. She said what everyone was thinking but few wanted to say out loud, that they all knew why Elise hadn't checked the ticket. That if you looked at Grant and then looked at Eudora, it was obvious what was happening here. The whispers grew. More passengers were tuning in now, their own conversations forgotten, their books set aside, their phones lowered. They were beginning to see what Zariah had seen immediately, that this wasn't about a ticket upgrade or a seating mistake. This was about bias. This was about assumptions. This was about an elderly black woman being treated as if she didn't belong in a space she had every right to occupy. A younger passenger in seat 6A, a black man in his 20s with locked hair and kind eyes, shook his head in disgust. He said this was crazy, that she was being treated like this just because she was black and the flight attendant was letting it happen. His voice carried more anger than he probably intended, the frustration of watching yet another injustice unfold in real time. An Asian woman across the aisle in seat 5B spoke up, her accent marking her as not American-born but her English perfectly clear and her moral clarity sharper than most native speakers. She said she couldn't believe Eudora was being questioned like this, that the woman had a boarding pass, that there was no reason Grant shouldn't be asked to prove his claim immediately. Her husband in seat 5C added that this didn't make any sense, that any reasonable person would verify both tickets before making a decision, that the flight attendant's failure to do so revealed exactly where her sympathies lay. Eudora felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. The stares. The whispers. The validation that yes, this was wrong, but also the painful reminder that this was her reality. She had paid for this seat. She had followed every rule. She had done everything right. And still she was the one being questioned. Still she was the one being made to feel like an intruder, like someone who didn't belong, like someone whose word couldn't be trusted. Zariah kept her hand on Eudora's arm, steadying her, anchoring her. She looked up at the elderly woman, her eyes full of compassion that seemed far too mature for someone who should still be worried about homework and soccer practice. She told Eudora she needed to help her sit down, not in Grant's seat, not yet, but somewhere because she could see that Eudora's body was giving out. Eudora nodded weakly, allowing this child to guide her to seat 4A, right next to where Zariah had been sitting. She sank into it gratefully, her breathing labored, her chest tight, her body trembling from the physical and emotional toll of standing for so long while being humiliated in front of strangers. Grant shifted in seat 3A, his smirk fading just slightly. For the first time, he seemed to register that this wasn't going the way he'd expected. The child wasn't backing down. The passengers were paying attention and worse, they were taking sides, against him. Annalise, the flight attendant who had been his ally just moments ago, now looked uncertain, her confidence cracking under the weight of collective scrutiny. But Grant was a man who had spent his life getting his way. He'd bulldozed through opposition in business deals, intimidated competitors, outlasted adversaries. He wasn't about to let an 11-year-old girl and a handful of self-righteous passengers change the outcome now. He declared that he didn't have time for this nonsense, that he had an important meeting in London and needed to prepare. He repeated his claim about upgrading his ticket and stated it was final, his tone suggesting the conversation was over simply because he said it was. Zariah turned to him, her voice calm but cutting through his bluster like a knife through paper. She told him to show them his boarding pass. If he'd really upgraded, it would say Seat 3A. All he had to do was show proof and this would be over. Grant pulled out his phone, making a show of it, his movements exaggerated as if he was doing them all a favor by indulging this ridiculous request. He said fine, that they wanted to see it, here it was. He held up his phone screen, but he held it at an angle where only he could really see it clearly, the screen tilted away from Zariah's line of sight. Zariah stepped closer, trying to see the screen, and Grant immediately pulled the phone back, jerking it away from her view. He told her he didn't need to show her anything, that she was just a little girl, that this was between him and the airline staff. The defensiveness in his actions spoke louder than any words could have. Zariah asked him directly why he wouldn't show his boarding pass if he had nothing to hide. The question was simple but devastating in its implication. Grant snapped that he didn't have to prove anything to her, his voice rising slightly, the first crack in his polished veneer showing through. Zariah simply said that was what she thought, her tone neutral but her meaning clear. His refusal to show the boarding pass told everyone in that cabin everything they needed to know. She turned to Elise, who was still standing there, frozen in indecision, caught between her training, her biases, and the growing pressure from the passengers around her. Zariah asked if she was going to check Grant's boarding pass or if she was going to keep letting him sit in Eudora's seat without proof. The question forced Elise to make a choice, to take a side, to either do her job or continue enabling the injustice. Elise looked panicked now. The entire cabin was watching her, waiting for her to do the right thing, waiting to see if she would choose protocol over prejudice. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her walkie-talkie. She said she would need to call the supervisor, that she needed to verify this properly, her voice lacking conviction but at least moving in the right direction. Grant protested, saying there was no need for that, that he'd told her he upgraded, his irritation now mixed with something that might have been nervousness. Elise cut him off, her voice firmer now, perhaps finding courage in the decision to escalate. She said she needed to check it properly, that the supervisor needed to be involved. She pressed the button on her walkie-talkie and called for Derek, saying she needed him in first class, that there was a situation that required his attention. The cabin fell silent again, everyone waiting. The energy had shifted from confrontation to anticipation. Justice felt close, tangible, within reach. But it wasn't here yet. Zariah remained standing between Grant and Eudora, a small but unmovable barrier, her school uniform and neat puffs making her look even younger than her 11 years, but her presence somehow larger than her physical size. She wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't backing down. And she wasn't going to let this man continue to occupy a seat he'd stolen. Eudora sat in 4A, her eyes closed, trying to catch her breath, trying to process everything that was happening. She felt gratitude and exhaustion in equal measure. Gratitude for this brave child who had stepped in when no one else would. Exhaustion from having to live through moments like this, from having to prove her worth and her right to occupy space over and over again throughout her life. Grant sat in 3A, his jaw clenched, his earlier confidence cracking like ice under pressure. He hadn't expected this kind of resistance. He'd assumed this would be easy, that his word would be enough, that his appearance and demeanor and the implicit bias in his favor would carry the day. He'd underestimated the power of a child's moral clarity and a cabin full of witnesses who were tired of looking away. The passengers waited. Some had their phones out, recording, documenting, preparing to share this moment with the world. Others sat in tense silence, their sympathies clearly with Eudora and Zariah, their disgust with Grant and Elise evident in their expressions. The energy in the cabin had completely transformed. What had started as individual discomfort had become collective outrage, a shared recognition that something fundamentally wrong was happening and needed to be corrected. A white woman in her 60s, sitting in seat 2B with silver hair and kind eyes, stood up slowly. She addressed Elise directly, her voice shaking not with fear but with controlled fury. She said she'd been flying for 40 years and had never seen someone treated this poorly. That Elise should be ashamed of herself. That this behavior was unacceptable and unprofessional. Elise looked like she wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor of the aircraft and never be seen again. Her face was red, her eyes glistening with what might have been tears of embarrassment or shame or both. She started to say she was sorry, that she was just trying to help, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The woman in 2B cut her off, saying Elise had tried to take Grant's side without even checking, that everyone in the cabin had seen it happen, that there was no point in pretending otherwise. The words were harsh but true, and they landed with the weight of undeniable fact. The validation from other passengers gave Eudora a strange mix of emotions. Relief that she wasn't alone in seeing the injustice. Pain that it had to happen at all. Gratitude for the strangers who were speaking up, who were refusing to stay silent, who were using their voices to amplify hers. And exhaustion, bone-deep exhaustion, from having to live through moments like this over and over again throughout her 73 years on Earth. Zoraya looked down at Eudora and squeezed her shoulder gently, telling her it was going to be okay, that the supervisor was coming, that they would fix this. Her voice carried a certainty that Eudora wanted desperately to believe in. Eudora looked up at this child, this brave, fierce, impossibly mature child, and felt tears slip down her cheeks. She thanked Zoraya, her voice breaking with emotion, unable to find adequate words to express the depth of her gratitude. Zoraya smiled, but it was a sad smile, wise beyond her years, carrying knowledge that no 11-year-old should have to carry. She told Eudora she didn't have to thank her, that this was what people were supposed to do, that standing up when something was wrong wasn't heroic, it was basic human decency. Eudora reached out and took Zoraya's hand, squeezing it tightly, holding onto this connection like a lifeline. She told Zoraya that her parents had raised her right, that they should be proud of the person she was becoming. Zoraya nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She said her daddy always told her that if you see injustice and you don't speak up, you become part of the problem. That silence in the face of wrong is its own kind of evil. And her mama said kindness wasn't optional, that it wasn't about being nice or polite, but about being just. That kindness, real kindness, was the only thing that mattered in the end. Those words hit Eudora like a wave, crashing over her with the force of truth. This child had been raised with love and values and strength. And she was using all of it, every lesson, every principle, every ounce of courage her parents had instilled in her, to defend a complete stranger. The standoff continued. Grant in the stolen seat. Eudora in the wrong seat. Zoraya standing guard between them. Elise waiting for backup, for someone with more authority to take this burden off her shoulders. And an entire first-class cabin holding its breath, waiting for someone in power to finally do the right thing. Footsteps approached from the front of the plane. Heavy, purposeful footsteps that carried the weight of authority. The supervisor was coming. Everyone could hear him before they could see him, his presence announced by the rhythm of his steps on the aircraft floor. And everyone, every single person in that cabin, was about to find out if justice would be served or if privilege would win again, if truth would prevail or if bias would carry the day, if this brave little girl's stand would be vindicated or dismissed. The tension was unbearable. The weight felt eternal. But the footsteps were getting closer. If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, subscribe now. What would you do if you saw this happening in front of you? Derek Vaughn appeared in the first-class cabin like a force of nature. He was a tall black man in his early 50s with close-cropped gray hair, a commanding presence, and eyes that had seen every kind of passenger conflict imaginable over his 27 years in aviation. He wore his supervisor uniform with the kind of pride that came from working his way up from baggage handler to his current position, from earning every promotion through dedication and excellence rather than connections or shortcuts. He took in the scene with practiced efficiency. Grant Holloway sitting in seat 3A, red-faced and defensive. Eudora Kingsley sitting in 4A, tears on her cheeks and exhaustion in every line of her body. Zoraya Cole standing between them like a tiny sentinel, her school uniform crisp and her expression determined. Elise Navarro looking like she wished she could disappear. And an entire cabin of passengers staring at him with expectation, with hope, with the weight of their collective demand for justice. Derek asked what the situation was, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. The cabin seemed to exhale slightly at his presence, at the arrival of someone who might finally set things right. Elise started to explain, her words tumbling over each other in her haste and nervousness. She said there was a disagreement about seat assignments, that this passenger, she gestured to Grant, claimed he'd upgraded his ticket, and this passenger, she gestured to Eudora, said the seat was hers. Derek's eyes narrowed slightly. He asked Elise directly if she had verified either passenger's boarding pass. The question was simple but pointed. cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Elise hesitated, her face flushing deeper. She admitted she hadn't, that Grant had said he'd upgraded and she had believed him, her voice trailing off as she realized how damning that sounded when said out loud. Derek's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He asked why she hadn't followed standard protocol, why she hadn't checked the boarding passes before making any assumptions. His tone wasn't angry, but it was firm, leaving no room for excuses. Elise had no answer. She stood there, silent, her hands twisting together, her earlier confidence completely shattered. Derek turned to Eudora, his expression softening immediately. He asked if she was all right, if she needed medical attention, his concern genuine and visible. The contrast between how he addressed Eudora versus how Elise had spoken to her was stark and not lost on anyone watching. Eudora said she was okay, just tired, that she needed her seat, her voice weak but steady. She handed him her boarding pass with shaking hands, the simple act of extending her arm requiring effort that showed how drained she was. Derek examined the boarding pass carefully, his eyes scanning every detail. He looked at the seat number on the overhead compartment. Seat 3A. Window. First class. The boarding pass was legitimate, properly issued, paid in full. There was no question, no ambiguity, no room for doubt. He turned to Grant, his voice dropping lower, taking on an edge that suggested his patience was wearing thin. He asked to see Grant's boarding pass, the request framed as a courtesy but carrying the weight of a command. Grant hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. Everyone saw it. The pause, the flash of panic in his eyes, the way his hand moved toward his phone and then stopped, the calculation happening behind his expression as he weighed his options. Derek's voice became more dangerous, quieter but somehow more forceful. He told Grant to show him the boarding pass immediately, that they needed to resolve the situation now. Grant fumbled with his phone, his fingers suddenly clumsy, dropping it once before managing to pull up his digital boarding pass. He held it out to Derek, the screen angled in a way that suggested he was hoping the supervisor wouldn't look too closely. Derek took the phone and examined the screen carefully, methodically, his expression unreadable. The cabin was dead silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Everyone waited. Derek looked up at Grant, his face neutral but his eyes hard. He stated the facts in a voice that cut through the cabin like a blade. Grant's boarding pass showed seat 27C. Economy class. There was no upgrade. No change to first class. No legitimate claim to seat 3A. The cabin erupted. Not in anger this time but in vindication. Passengers cheered. Some stood up. Others clapped. The young woman who had been recording the whole thing on her phone let out a whoop of triumph. The collective relief and satisfaction was palpable, a release of tension that had been building for what felt like hours but had probably been less than 30 minutes. Grant's face went white, then red, then white again. He looked around the cabin desperately, searching for support, for sympathy, for anyone who might believe whatever explanation he was scrambling to construct. But he found none. Only disgust. Only judgment. Only the consequences of his own actions staring back at him from every direction. Derek wasn't finished. His voice remained calm but carried the weight of absolute authority when he said Grant had lied about upgrading his ticket. That he had taken a seat that didn't belong to him. That he had refused to move when the rightful passenger requested her seat. And that his actions had caused distress to another passenger and disrupted the cabin. He pressed a button on his radio and called for security, saying he had a passenger who needed to be removed from the aircraft. The words landed with finality. Grant tried to speak, to explain, to salvage something from this disaster. He started to say it was a misunderstanding, that he'd made a mistake, that surely they could work this out without involving security. Derek cut him off with a look that could have frozen water. He told Grant to collect his belongings immediately, that he would be escorted off this flight, and that the airline would be filing a report about this incident. There would be no negotiation, no second chances, no opportunity to talk his way out of the consequences. Grant grabbed his bag from the overhead compartment, his movements jerky and panicked, his hands shaking in a way that betrayed how completely his composure had shattered. He tried to avoid eye contact with everyone, but there was nowhere to hide. Every passenger in first class was watching him, and most of them weren't bothering to hide their satisfaction at seeing him exposed. As he moved toward the aisle, he had to pass Soraya. For a brief moment, their eyes met. And in that moment, Grant saw something in this 11-year-old girl's eyes that shook him more than Derek's authority or the security team waiting to escort him off. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't celebrating. She was just looking at him with a kind of sad understanding, as if she'd known from the beginning exactly how this would end, as if she'd seen men like him before and knew that their entitlement always eventually caught up with them. Zariah spoke softly, just loud enough for Grant to hear. She told him that maybe next time he'd think twice before lying and taking something that didn't belong to him. Grant flinched as if she'd slapped him. Because she was right. He had lied. He had tried to take something that wasn't his. And he'd assumed he could get away with it because of who he was and who Eudora wasn't, because of the color of his skin and hers, because of the implicit bias he'd counted on working in his favor the way it always had before. Security officers appeared at the cabin door, their presence official and unmistakable. Grant was escorted toward the exit, and as he walked that gauntlet of watching passengers, several couldn't resist parting shots. Someone said he should be ashamed of himself. Another voice called out asking if his big important meeting was worth this humiliation. A third person suggested he Google himself and see how this incident would follow him online. Grant disappeared down the jetway, escorted by security, his dignity in tatters, his reputation about to take a hit he probably couldn't have imagined when he'd sat down in that seat. Derek turned to Eudora, his expression warm and genuinely apologetic. He told her how sorry he was for what she'd been put through, that this should never have happened, that she had every right to be upset. Eudora said she just wanted to sit in her seat, that she was very tired, her simple request carrying the weight of everything she'd endured. Derek helped her stand from 4A, his hands gentle and respectful, supporting her without treating her as fragile or helpless. Zariah moved to her other side, and together they helped Eudora make her way to seat 3A. Her seat. The seat she'd paid for. The seat that should have been hers from the beginning without question, without confrontation, without having to prove her worth. As Eudora lowered herself into the seat, the relief was visible on every part of her face and body. Not just physical relief, though that was certainly there, the comfort of a proper seat, the ability to finally rest her aching joints, but emotional relief. The relief of being believed. The relief of being vindicated. The relief of being treated with the dignity she deserved. The passengers around her erupted in applause again, spontaneous and genuine, celebrating not just the resolution but the principle that had been upheld. Justice had been served. Truth had prevailed. The right thing had been done, even if it had taken far too long and required far too much effort. Derek turned to Elise, his voice quiet but every passenger nearby could hear him. He told her they needed to talk, that what had happened here was a serious breach of protocol, that her actions had caused harm to a passenger and created a situation that should never have occurred. Elise's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, unable to speak, the full weight of her failure crashing down on her. Derek continued, saying he was disappointed, that she'd been trained better than this, that allowing bias to influence her judgment was unacceptable. He told her to go to the back galley and wait for him there, that they would discuss this in detail once he'd made sure Eudora was properly settled. Elise walked toward the back of the plane, her shoulders hunched, her face crumpling. She knew her career had just taken a serious hit. She knew this incident would be in her file, that it would follow her, that the comfortable certainty she'd felt in her biases had just cost her dearly. The cabin slowly began to settle. Passengers returned to their seats, but the conversations buzzed with energy. Some were texting friends about what they'd just witnessed. Others were uploading videos to social media, the footage already spreading beyond the confines of the aircraft. The story was becoming bigger than just one flight, one woman, one seat. Zariah returned to her seat in 4B, buckling herself in. She picked up her book about space exploration, but her hands were shaking slightly now, the adrenaline of the confrontation catching up with her. She'd stood up to a grown man. She'd challenged authority. She'd refused to back down even when told to mind her business. And she'd won. But it didn't feel like winning. It felt like having to fight for something that should have been given freely. It felt like watching an elderly woman be humiliated for no reason other than the color of her skin. It felt like being reminded, once again, that the world her parents had tried to prepare her for was exactly as broken as they'd said it was. Eudora reached over from 3A and took Zariah's hand. She told her thank you, that she didn't know what she would have done without her, that Zariah had saved her from something worse than just losing a seat. Zoraya smiled, though her eyes were still bright with unshed tears. She told Eudora she was glad she could help, that nobody should have to go through what she'd just experienced. Eudora squeezed her hand and said Zoraya's parents must be so proud of her. Zoraya said she hoped so, that she tried to do what they taught her, to stand up for what was right even when it was hard. The two of them sat like that for a moment, hands clasped across the armrest between their seats, two souls connected by circumstance and courage, by injustice witnessed and justice demanded. Around them, other passengers began approaching. The man from seat 4C leaned over and told Eudora he was sorry she'd had to go through that it shouldn't have happened, that she'd handled it with more grace than most people could have managed. Eudora smiled at him and said thank you, that she appreciated his words more than he knew. He grinned and said that little girl right there was something special, nodding toward Zoraya. His wife added that Zoraya was really amazing, that she'd shown courage most adults didn't possess. Eudora glanced at Zoraya, who was trying to disappear into her book, embarrassed by the praise. She told them that yes, this child was extraordinary, that she'd give anything to have raised her herself. The older white woman from 2B turned around in her seat and spoke directly to Zoraya. She said she'd been a teacher for 35 years and had never seen a student with as much moral clarity and courage as Zoraya had just demonstrated. That the world needed more people like her. Zoraya ducked her head, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She mumbled a thank you, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention now that the crisis had passed. A middle-aged black woman from seat 6B approached with tears streaming down her face. She told Eudora she was sorry, that watching what had happened had brought back memories of her own mother being treated similarly, that it was painful to see but also healing to witness someone finally standing up and being vindicated. Eudora reached out and squeezed the woman's hand, the two of them sharing a moment of understanding that needed no words. They knew. They both lived it. They both understood the exhausting reality of having to constantly prove your right to exist in spaces where others were simply assumed to belong. The conversations continued. Passengers sharing their own stories, their own experiences with bias and discrimination, their own moments of standing up or wishing they had. The cabin had become something more than just a collection of strangers traveling to the same destination. It had become a community, forged through shared witness to injustice and its correction. Derek returned after about 10 minutes. He approached Eudora's seat and asked again if she was all right, if she needed anything. Water, a blanket, medical attention, anything at all. Eudora assured him she was fine now, that she just needed to rest and get to London to see her daughter and granddaughter. Derek's expression softened further when he heard that. He told her about having a daughter himself, about understanding the pull of family, about knowing how important this trip must be for her. He said he'd make sure the rest of her flight was as comfortable as possible, that he'd personally check on her periodically, and that she should not hesitate to ask for anything she needed. Then he turned to Zoraya. He told her she was incredibly brave, that what she'd done was remarkable, that most adults wouldn't have had the courage to stand up the way she had. Zoraya looked up at him, her eyes still holding that wise sadness that seemed far beyond her years. She told him she'd just done what her parents taught her, that it was nothing special. Derek chuckled and said her parents must be extraordinary people to have raised such an extraordinary daughter. He asked where she was headed, making conversation to help ease the tension she was clearly still carrying. Zoraya told him she was going to boarding school in Switzerland, that she'd be there for the next few years. Derek said Switzerland was lucky to have her, that she'd probably change that school for the better just by being there. He moved to the front of the cabin and picked up the PA system. His voice filled not just first class but echoed back into the economy sections as well, where word of what had happened had already spread through the aircraft. He announced that before they took off, he wanted to acknowledge someone in their cabin who had demonstrated extraordinary courage and compassion. That young Zoraya Cole had stood up for what was right when many adults had remained silent. That she had reminded everyone on this flight what true bravery looked like. And that the airline was grateful to have passengers like her who held them to the highest standards of fairness and justice. The entire plane erupted in applause. Not just first class but economy too. Passengers who had only heard second-hand accounts of what happened were clapping, whistling, and calling out their support. The sound was thunderous, overwhelming, a collective celebration of courage and justice. Zoraya's face turned bright red. She sank lower in her seat, mortified by the attention but also secretly pleased, understanding that what she'd done mattered, that people recognized its importance. Eudora reached over and squeezed her hand again, telling her to let them celebrate her, that she deserved it, that she'd earned it. Zoraya smiled despite her embarrassment, allowing herself to accept the recognition for just a moment before returning her attention to her book, signaling that she was ready for things to return to normal. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, the energy in the cabin finally started to settle into something like normalcy. Passengers returned to their books, their movies, their conversations. But there was an undercurrent of connection now, a sense that they'd all been part of something important, something that would stay with them long after this flight landed. Eudora looked out the window as the terminal building slid past. She thought about Camille waiting for her in London, probably pacing at the arrivals hall, excited and nervous about her mother's first meeting with baby Arya. She thought about how close she'd come to making this journey in pain and humiliation, cramped in a seat that wasn't hers, treated as if she didn't matter. But that hadn't happened, because a brave little girl had refused to let it happen. Like this video, if you believe standing up for others is important. Why do you think so many adults stayed silent while Zoraya spoke up? The flight across the Atlantic stretched ahead of them, 7 hours of cruising altitude and recycled air. But the atmosphere in first class had fundamentally changed from what it had been during boarding. What had been a space of individual isolation, passengers cocooned in their own expensive bubbles of comfort and privacy, had become something else entirely. A community forged through shared witness to injustice and its correction. Eudora sat in seat 3A, finally able to rest. She'd reclined her seat slightly, adjusted the lumbar support to ease the pressure on her lower back, and accepted the bottle of water and warm towel that Monica, the younger flight attendant, had brought her. Monica had kind eyes and a genuine smile, so different from Elise's trained politeness. She'd apologized profusely for what had happened, saying it should never have occurred, that Eudora deserved better. Eudora had accepted the apology with grace, telling Monica that she appreciated her kindness, that it meant more than the young woman probably realized. Monica had promised to check on her regularly throughout the flight, to make sure she had everything she needed, and Eudora could tell the promise was sincere. The physical relief of finally sitting in a proper seat, of being able to stretch her legs and support her back, was immense. But it was the emotional relief that truly overwhelmed her. The relief of being believed. The relief of being vindicated. The relief of knowing that this time justice had been served, even if it had taken too long and required too much effort. Zoraya was settled back in seat 4B, her book about space exploration open in her lap. She was reading about the mechanics of orbital velocity, about how spacecraft needed to reach specific speeds to break free from Earth's gravitational pull. The physics were fascinating, the mathematics elegant, but she found her mind drifting back to what had just happened. She kept glancing over at Eudora, making sure the elderly woman was comfortable, making sure she wasn't in distress. Zoraya had learned from her mother that standing up for justice wasn't a one-time action. It was a commitment that extended beyond the immediate confrontation. It meant checking in, following through, making sure the person you defended was actually okay and not just temporarily relieved. The other passengers had mostly returned to their own activities, but the conversations happening around the cabin still carried echoes of what had occurred. People were processing, reflecting, sharing their own stories and experiences. The incident had opened something in the collective consciousness of the cabin, had given permission for discussions that usually remained unspoken. The man from seat 4C, who had introduced himself as Marcus Wellington during one of the conversations after Derek had removed Grant, leaned slightly toward his wife. He spoke in a low voice, but Zoraya could hear him from her seat. He said he couldn't stop thinking about how many times he'd witnessed similar situations and stayed silent, how he'd told himself it wasn't his place to get involved, how he'd rationalized his inaction by saying someone else would surely speak up. His wife, Amara, nodded slowly. She said she understood that feeling, that she'd done the same thing countless times. That watching an 11-year-old girl show more courage than a cabin full of adults had forced her to confront her own complicity in systems of injustice. Marcus said seeing Zoraya stand up had been both inspiring and convicting. That it had shown him courage wasn't about size or age or power, it was about conviction and willingness to act despite the social pressure to stay quiet. Amara agreed, adding that she kept thinking about her own daughters, wondering if she was raising them to be like Zoraya, to speak up when they saw wrong, to put compassion above comfort. She said she wasn't sure she was doing enough, wasn't sure her example was strong enough. Their conversation was one of many happening throughout the cabin. People were being forced to examine themselves, their choices, their silences. And that examination was uncomfortable but necessary. A white couple in seats 3C and 3D, who had been whispering throughout the initial confrontation, were having their own reckoning. The woman, Jessica, said she was ashamed of how long she'd waited to pull out her phone to record. That she'd been worried about being seen as causing drama, about making the situation worse, about all the social conditioning that told her to mind her business. Her partner, Daniel, admitted he'd been paralyzed by the same fears. That he'd been raised to be polite, to not make waves, to assume authority figures knew what they were doing. But watching Zariah challenge that assumption had shown him how his politeness had become complicity, how his desire to avoid confrontation had made him a bystander to injustice. Jessica said she never wanted to be that person again, the one who watched and did nothing. That if this situation had taught her anything, it was that silence in the face of wrong was its own kind of violence. The older white woman from seat 2B, who had finally spoken up during the confrontation, was talking to her husband in seat 2A. Her name was Patricia, and she'd been a school principal for 30 years before retiring. She told her husband, Robert, that she'd seen this exact pattern play out in schools countless times. Black students being assumed to be lying, being questioned more harshly, being punished more severely for the same behaviors that white students were excused for. She said she tried to be fair, had implemented policies meant to address bias, but she wondered now how many times her own unconscious assumptions had caused harm. How many times she'd believed the wrong person because their appearance aligned with her expectations of credibility. Robert listened quietly, then admitted he'd been uncomfortable from the moment Elise had made that comment about Eudora not looking like she could afford first class. That he'd known it was wrong but hadn't known how to intervene, hadn't wanted to make a scene, hadn't been sure his voice would matter. Patricia said that was the insidious thing about this kind of bias. It made everyone complicit. The person enacting it, the people witnessing it, even the victim who had been so conditioned to this treatment that they sometimes doubted their own reality. The young black woman from seat 5C, who had been one of the first to start recording, was on her phone composing a thread about what she'd just witnessed. Her name was Kendra, and she was a journalist who wrote about race and social justice. She'd been flying to London for a conference on media representation, and now she had a story that perfectly illustrated every point she'd been planning to make in her presentation. She typed rapidly, her fingers flying across her phone screen. She wrote about how bias operates in everyday spaces, how it's often wrapped in politeness and procedure, how it relies on collective silence to maintain itself. She wrote about Eudora's dignity in the face of humiliation, about Zariah's courage despite her age, about how justice had only been served because one person refused to accept injustice as normal. Her thread would go viral within hours, shared thousands of times, sparking conversations about air travel, about customer service, about the countless ways bias manifests in daily life. But she didn't know that yet. Right now, she was just trying to capture the truth of what she'd witnessed before the details faded. The Asian woman from seat 5B, whose name was Lynn, was talking to her husband about how the incident had resonated with her own experiences of being made to feel like she didn't belong in spaces where she had every right to be. She talked about being followed in stores, being asked repeatedly if she was sure she was in the right place, being treated as a perpetual foreigner despite being born in the United States. Her husband, James, who was white, admitted he'd never fully understood what she meant when she described these experiences. That he'd believed her intellectually but hadn't viscerally grasped the exhaustion of constantly having to prove your right to occupy space. But watching it happen to Eudora, seeing the assumption and dismissal play out in real time, had made it real in a way her stories hadn't. Lynn said that was the problem with this kind of discrimination. It was often invisible to those who didn't experience it, subtle enough to be dismissed as misunderstanding or oversensitivity, but constant enough to be utterly draining for those who lived through it day after day. Throughout the cabin, similar conversations were happening. White passengers confronting their own biases and silences. Passengers of color sharing their stories and seeing them validated by the collective outrage. Everyone processing what they'd witnessed and what it meant about the world they lived in. Eudora listened to these conversations with mixed emotions. Part of her was grateful that people were learning, growing, having their eyes open to realities she'd known her entire life. But part of her was tired, so tired, of her pain having to be the lesson that taught them. Of her humiliation being the catalyst for their awakening. Of her experience being treated as an educational opportunity rather than a violation that should never have occurred. She closed her eyes and tried to focus on why she was on this plane. Camille. Baby Aria. The joy waiting for her at the end of this journey. She couldn't let this incident, as painful as it had been, overshadow the purpose of her trip. Zoraya noticed Eudora's expression, the way the elderly woman seemed to be withdrawing into herself. She set down her book and leaned toward her, asking softly if she was okay, if she needed anything. Eudora opened her eyes and looked at this remarkable child. She said she was okay, just thinking about her daughter and granddaughter, trying to focus on the good things waiting for her in London. Zoraya nodded in understanding. She asked about Eudora's daughter, what she did, how long she'd been in London. Eudora's face lit up when she talked about Camille. She told Zoraya that her daughter was an associate director at a pharmaceutical company, that she'd worked incredibly hard to get there, that she was brilliant and dedicated and had built a wonderful life in London. She said Camille had met her husband, Thomas, at the company. He was British, a research scientist, kind and gentle and perfect for her daughter. She pulled out her phone and showed Zoraya pictures. Camille as a little girl, gap-toothed and grinning. Camille on her college graduation day, proud and beaming. Camille and Thomas on their wedding day, looking at each other with obvious adoration. Camille pregnant, glowing with anticipation. Zoraya looked at each picture with genuine interest, asking questions, commenting on how beautiful Camille was, how happy she looked. She asked about baby Aria, how old she was, what her name meant. Eudora's entire demeanor changed as she talked about her granddaughter. Aria was 6 weeks old, named after the musical term because both Camille and Thomas loved classical music. Eudora hadn't met her yet. Camille had wanted to wait until she'd recovered from the birth and felt ready for visitors. But they'd video called almost every day, and Eudora had watched her granddaughter through a screen, longing to hold her in person. She showed Zoraya the photos Camille had sent. Aria sleeping, her tiny fists curled near her face. Aria yawning, her mouth open in a perfect O. Aria being held by Thomas, looking impossibly small in his large hands. Aria wearing a onesie that said, "Grandma's Girl," that Eudora had mailed weeks ago. Zoraya's eyes softened as she looked at the photos. She said Aria was beautiful, that Eudora must be so excited to finally meet her. She said her own mother always talked about how special the bond between grandmother and grandchild was, how it was different from any other relationship. Eudora smiled, genuine joy breaking through the exhaustion. She said that was exactly what she'd been told, that she couldn't wait to experience it, that these 3 years of distance from Camille had been the hardest of her life, but this made it all worthwhile. The conversation between them became a refuge from the heavier emotions of what had just transpired. They talked about family, about London, about Zoraya's boarding school in Switzerland. Zoraya told Eudora about her own family, her father Donovan who ran the bank but still made time to coach her soccer team, her mother Imani who fought for justice in courtrooms but also made the best chocolate chip cookies in the world. She talked about how her parents had taught her that privilege came with responsibility, that having advantages meant you had an obligation to use them to help others. She said her father always told her that the true measure of a person wasn't what they did when everyone was watching, but what they did when no one would ever know. That integrity meant doing the right thing even when it cost you something. Eudora listened with tears in her eyes. She told Zoraya that her parents sounded like extraordinary people, that they'd raised an extraordinary daughter. She said Zoraya reminded her of Camille at that age, confident, compassionate, unwilling to accept injustice as inevitable. Zoraya blushed at the comparison, saying she hoped she could be half as successful and kind as Camille clearly was. The hours passed. The flight attendants came through with meal service, offering the first-class passengers their choice of entrees. Monica made sure both Eudora and Zoraya had everything they needed, went out of her way to accommodate dietary preferences, brought extra bread when Zoraya mentioned she was still hungry. Other flight attendants stopped by to apologize to Eudora, to express their dismay at what had happened, to assure her that Elise's behavior didn't represent the airline's values. Some of them were clearly sincere. Others seemed more concerned with liability and public relations. Eudora accepted all the apologies with grace, too tired to sort through which were genuine and which were performative. Derek checked on her 3 times during the flight, each time asking if she was comfortable, if she needed anything, if there was anything he could do to make the rest of her journey better. He told her that there would be a formal investigation into the incident, that both Grant's behavior and Elise's failure to follow protocol would be addressed. He said he couldn't share details of the disciplinary process, but he wanted her to know that what had happened was being taken seriously. Eudora thanked him for his attention and his care. She said she didn't want to get anyone fired, that she just wanted to be treated fairly. Derek assured her that fairness was exactly what the investigation would pursue, that accountability wasn't about punishment but about ensuring this didn't happen to anyone else. As the flight progressed, Eudora found herself relaxing for the first time since boarding. The seat was comfortable. Her body was finally getting the rest it needed. The pain in her knees and hips was subsiding. And she was surrounded by people who had shown her kindness, who had stood up for her, who had reminded her that goodness existed even in moments of ugliness. She dozed off periodically, her sleep light but restorative. Each time she woke, Zariah was there, sometimes reading her book, sometimes looking out the window at the clouds below, sometimes just sitting quietly with her own thoughts. The girl's presence was comforting, a reminder that she wasn't alone. The passengers around them continued their conversations, their reflections, their processing. The incident had become a shared reference point, a moment that had bound them together and changed how they saw each other and themselves. Several people exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch, to continue the conversations they'd started. Kendra, the journalist, showed Eudora her phone at one point, revealing that her thread about the incident had already been shared over 10,000 times. People were responding with their own stories, their own experiences of bias in travel and customer service. The conversation was spreading far beyond the confines of this aircraft. Eudora looked at the screen with a mixture of emotions. She was glad the story was being told, glad it was prompting discussions about bias and justice. But she also felt exposed, vulnerable, aware that her humiliation was now public in a way she hadn't anticipated or consented to. Kendra seemed to sense her discomfort. She asked if Eudora was okay with her having shared the story, saying she could delete it if it made Eudora uncomfortable. She said she'd been careful not to include Eudora's full name or identifying details beyond what was necessary to tell the story truthfully. Eudora thought about it, then told Kendra it was okay. That if her experience could help prevent this from happening to someone else, then the discomfort was worth it. That maybe the only way to change these patterns was to make them visible, to shine light on the bias that usually operated in shadows. Kendra thanked her, saying that kind of generosity, being willing to let personal pain serve a larger purpose, was rare and valuable. She promised to send Eudora links to any articles that came from this story, to make sure she was informed about how her experience was being discussed. Marcus, the businessman from 4C, approached Eudora's seat during a quiet moment. He told her he'd been thinking about the incident all flight, that it had forced him to confront his own silence in similar situations. He said he worked in corporate America, that he saw bias play out every day in hiring decisions, promotion discussions, performance reviews. That he told himself he was making a difference by being successful, by being a visible black executive, but now he wondered if that was just rationalization for his own comfort. He asked Eudora if she had any advice, any wisdom from her years of navigating these situations. How did she maintain her dignity? How did she keep fighting when the battles never seemed to end? Eudora was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Then she told him she didn't have easy answers, that some days she maintained her dignity better than others, that there were times she'd failed to speak up or had accepted less than she deserved because she was too tired to fight. She said the key, if there was one, was remembering that her worth wasn't determined by how others treated her. That she couldn't control their bias, but she could control her response to it. That dignity came from knowing who she was, independent of anyone else's judgment. But she also said that no one should have to maintain dignity in the face of constant indignity. That the burden shouldn't be on the victims of bias to be strong or gracious or educational. That the real work had to be done by people like him, people with power and platform, to change the systems that created these situations in the first place. Marcus nodded slowly, taking in her words. He said she was right, that he'd been so focused on surviving and succeeding within the system that he'd stopped questioning whether the system itself needed to be dismantled. He promised her he would do better, would use his position to advocate for change, would refuse to be silent when silence was easier. Eudora squeezed his hand and told him she believed him, that she could see his sincerity, that the world needed more people willing to do the uncomfortable work of examining their complicity and choosing action over comfort. As the flight continued, the cabin gradually settled into a peaceful rhythm. The initial intensity of emotion had given way to quiet reflection. People read, watched movies, slept. But beneath the surface normalcy, something fundamental had shifted. Every person in that cabin had been changed by what they'd witnessed, had been forced to confront questions about justice, bias, courage, and complicity. Zariah returned to her book, but she found herself reading the same page multiple times without absorbing the words. She was thinking about what had happened, about what it meant, about the lessons her parents had tried to teach her being tested in real life. She'd stood up because it was right, but she hadn't anticipated how it would feel. The fear, the adrenaline, the satisfaction of seeing justice served, the exhaustion that came after. She wondered if this was what her mother felt after winning a case, after fighting for someone and seeing them vindicated. She wondered if this mixture of emotions, pride and sadness, satisfaction and weariness, was what justice always felt like. Not pure triumph, but something more complex and bittersweet. Eudora looked over at Zariah and saw the thoughtful expression on the girl's face. She asked what she was thinking about, if she was okay. Zariah looked up and smiled, a small, genuine smile. She said she was okay, just processing everything, thinking about how much harder this must be for people like Eudora who faced it all the time, not just once on a plane but constantly, in every space, every interaction. Eudora's eyes filled with tears at the depth of understanding in this child's words. She told Zariah yes, that was exactly right, that the exhaustion came not from any single incident but from the accumulation of them, from the constant vigilance required, from never being able to fully relax because you never knew when you'd have to defend your right to exist in space. But she also told Zariah not to carry that weight too heavily, not to let the injustice in the world rob her of joy and hope. That people like Zariah, people with privilege who chose to use it for good, people with power who chose to share it, were the ones who would ultimately change things. That Zariah's generation could build a different world if they chose to, if they maintained the courage she'd shown today. Zariah promised she would try. That she wouldn't forget this moment, this lesson, this reminder of why her parents had taught her that kindness wasn't negotiable and justice wasn't optional. The two of them sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the clouds pass by the window, each lost in their own thoughts but connected by the experience they'd shared. The flight was more than halfway complete now. London was getting closer with each passing minute. For Eudora, that meant reunion with her daughter and finally meeting her granddaughter. For Zariah, it meant continuing her journey to Switzerland, to school, to the next chapter of her life. But first they had this flight, this connection, this moment of having stood together against injustice and won. It was enough. It had to be enough. Subscribe if you believe courage can come from the most unexpected places. Who do you think showed more courage in this situation? Zariah for speaking up, or the adult passengers who finally joined her? The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing they were beginning their descent into London Heathrow. Passengers were asked to return their seats to the upright position, to stow their tray tables, to prepare for landing. The familiar rituals of arrival began, the cabin stirring from the lull of mid-flight into the anticipation of destination. Eudora straightened her seat and looked out the window. Below, she could see the patchwork of English countryside giving way to the sprawl of Greater London. Somewhere down there, Camille was probably already at the airport, pacing nervously, checking her phone, counting down the minutes until her mother's plane landed. The thought filled Eudora with warmth that pushed aside the lingering hurt from the earlier confrontation. She was almost there. Almost to her daughter. Almost to her granddaughter. The journey that had started with humiliation was ending with hope. Zariah began organizing her belongings, tucking her book into her backpack, making sure her passport was easily accessible. She had a connection to catch, another flight that would take her to Geneva, and then a car service that would drive her to the school in the Swiss Alps. She was used to traveling alone, used to navigating airports and connections, but something about this flight had made her feel less alone than usual. She looked over at Eudora, who was gathering her own things, moving slowly and carefully, her arthritis making even simple movements deliberate. Zariah asked if Eudora needed help with anything, if there was anything she could carry for her. Eudora smiled and said she was fine, that she'd managed for 73 years and could manage a bit longer. But her tone was warm, appreciative of the offer. As the plane descended, Derek appeared one more time. He approached Eudora's seat with something in his hand, an envelope. He told her the airline wanted to apologize formally for what had happened, that this letter contained a full refund of her ticket and a voucher for a future flight. He said it wasn't enough, that no amount of money could compensate for the distress she'd experienced, but he hoped she would accept it as a sincere gesture of regret. Eudora took the envelope, surprised. She thanked Derek, saying this was unexpected and generous. She admitted that part of her had worried the airline would try to minimize what happened, would treat it as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a serious failure. Derek assured her that wasn't the case. He said the incident had been reported to senior management, that there would be mandatory retraining for the entire cabin crew on implicit bias and proper protocol. He said Elise would face consequences appropriate to her actions, though he couldn't share specific details of the disciplinary process. He also told Eudora that Grant Holloway had been banned from the airline pending a full investigation. That his behavior, lying about his ticket, refusing to move, causing a disturbance, had violated multiple terms of carriage. That there would be consequences for him as well. Eudora nodded, taking this in. She said she didn't take pleasure in anyone being punished, but she was glad the airline was treating this seriously, was making changes to prevent it from happening again. Derek then turned to Zariah. He told her that the airline wanted to recognize her courage as well, that her actions had not only helped Eudora but had also highlighted areas where their training and protocols needed improvement. He handed her an envelope as well, explaining it contained a letter of commendation and a voucher for future travel that she could use herself or give to her parents. Zariah accepted it politely, though she looked uncomfortable with the recognition. She said she didn't do it for rewards, that she'd just done what anyone should do. Derek smiled and said that was exactly why she deserved recognition, because she'd acted not for gain but from genuine compassion and conviction. He said the world needed more people like her, and the airline was honored that she'd been on their flight. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels kissing the tarmac with barely a bump. Passengers applauded, as they often did on international flights, celebrating the successful crossing of an ocean. But in first class, the applause felt like it carried additional meaning, a final acknowledgement of everything that had transpired during this journey. As passengers filed off the plane, Zariah stayed in her seat, waiting with Eudora. The elderly woman moved slowly, and Zariah wanted to make sure she got off safely, that she had help if she needed it. Monica, the flight attendant, appeared with a wheelchair. She told Eudora that they'd arranged for wheelchair assistance to take her through the airport to arrivals, to make sure she didn't have to walk long distances after such an exhausting flight. Eudora wanted to protest, to insist she could walk, but her body overruled her pride. She accepted the wheelchair gratefully, allowing Monica to help her transition from the seat. Zariah gathered both her own bag and Eudora's carry-on, refusing to let the elderly woman struggle with luggage on top of everything else. She walked beside the wheelchair as Monica pushed Eudora toward the exit. They moved through the jetway and into the terminal. Heathrow was bustling with travelers, the massive airport humming with constant motion. Monica pushed Eudora's wheelchair efficiently through the corridors, navigating crowds and corners with practiced ease. Zariah walked alongside, still carrying the bags. At the junction where they'd have to part ways, Eudora toward arrivals, Zariah toward her connecting flight, they stopped. This was goodbye. This was the end of their shared journey. Eudora reached up from the wheelchair and took both of Zariah's hands in hers. She told her she would never forget what Zariah had done, that this child had given her more than just a seat on a plane. She'd given her dignity, validation, and hope. She'd shown her that the next generation might be different, might be better, might finally build the world that Eudora's generation had been fighting for. Zariah's eyes filled with tears. She told Eudora she would never forget her either, that meeting her had been an honor, that she hoped Eudora had the most wonderful time meeting her granddaughter. Then Zariah handed the carry-on bag to Monica, squeezed Eudora's hand one more time and turned to go. She walked toward her gate, her small figure gradually disappearing into the crowd of travelers. Eudora watched until she couldn't see her anymore, her heart full of gratitude and affection for this remarkable child who had changed her life in the span of a single flight. Monica began pushing the wheelchair again, heading toward arrivals. She chatted gently with Eudora, asking about her daughter and granddaughter, helping to shift Eudora's focus from goodbye to the reunion waiting ahead. As they approached the arrivals hall, Eudora could see people waiting behind barriers, holding signs, scanning the emerging passengers for familiar faces. And there, near the front, she spotted Camille. Her daughter looked beautiful. Her hair was styled differently than in the photos, cut shorter and more practical for new motherhood. She was wearing jeans and a flowing top that accommodated her post-pregnancy body. And cradled in her arms, wrapped in a pink blanket, was Aria. Camille's face lit up the moment she saw her mother. She started waving frantically, calling out, tears already streaming down her face. Eudora felt her own tears flowing freely now, all the emotion of the day, the hurt, the exhaustion, the vindication, the connection with Zariah, and now this overwhelming joy, pouring out. Monica pushed the wheelchair through the barrier and Camille rushed forward. She leaned down carefully, mindful of the baby in her arms, and kissed her mother's forehead, her cheeks, her hands. She kept saying she couldn't believe her mother was finally here, that she'd missed her so much, that she had so much to tell her. Eudora reached up to touch Camille's face, to assure herself this was real, that she was really here with her daughter after 3 long years. Then her eyes moved to the bundle in Camille's arms. Camille gently shifted Arya so Eudora could see her clearly. The baby was awake, her dark eyes wide and curious, taking in the bright lights and commotion of the airport. She had a perfectly round face, smooth brown skin and a tiny rosebud mouth. She was absolutely perfect. Eudora gasped, her hand moving to her mouth. She asked if she could hold her, her voice trembling with anticipation and awe. Camille carefully transferred Arya into her mother's arms. Eudora cradled her granddaughter against her chest, supporting the tiny head, marveling at how light she felt, how fragile and precious. Arya made a small sound, something between a coo and a sigh, and nestled into Eudora's embrace as if she'd been waiting for exactly this. Eudora began to cry in earnest then, great heaving sobs of joy and relief and overwhelming love. All the pain of the flight, all the exhaustion of the journey, all the loneliness of 3 years apart, it all melted away in the warmth of holding this tiny human who carried her family's future. Camille knelt beside the wheelchair, her arm around her mother's shoulders, both of them looking down at Arya with wonder. She asked if the flight had been okay, if her mother was all right. Eudora hesitated, then decided this moment was too precious to cloud with the story of Grant and Elise. She told Camille there had been some difficulties but that everything had worked out fine, that she'd met an amazing young woman who had helped her, that she would tell the full story later but right now she just wanted to be here in this moment with her girls. Camille accepted this, trusting that her mother would share what needed to be shared when the time was right. She told her mother about the apartment she'd prepared, about the nursery they'd set up, about all the plans she had for their time together. But Eudora barely heard the details. She was lost in Arya's face, in counting her tiny fingers, in memorizing every feature, in thanking God or fate or whatever force had brought her safely across an ocean to this moment. Monica stood back, giving them privacy, but she was smiling. This was why she did this job, not for the salary or the travel benefits but for moments like this. Reunions. Well, families coming together across distances. This was what made all the difficult passengers and long hours worthwhile. Thomas appeared then, Camille's husband, having parked the car. He was a tall, gentle-looking man with kind eyes and a warm smile. He greeted Eudora with genuine affection, telling her how happy he was to finally meet her in person after years of video calls. He thanked her for making the long journey, saying it meant the world to Camille. Eudora smiled up at him, still cradling Arya, and said she would have crossed 10 oceans to be here for this. They gathered Eudora's luggage from baggage claim, Thomas handling the heavy bags while Monica continued to push the wheelchair. As they walked toward the exit, toward the car park, toward home, Eudora felt the weight of the day beginning to lift. Yes, she'd been humiliated. Yes, she'd been treated unjustly. Yes, she'd had to fight for something that should have been freely given. But she'd also been defended by a brave child. She'd been supported by strangers who became allies. She'd seen justice served. And now she was here, holding her granddaughter, surrounded by her family. The bad didn't cancel out the good, and the good didn't erase the bad. Both existed together, woven into the complicated tapestry of her life, of any life lived while black in a world that still harbored bias and hatred alongside kindness and justice. As they reached the car and Thomas began loading luggage, Eudora looked down at Arya one more time. She whispered to her granddaughter that she had so many stories to tell her when she was older. Stories about her mother Camille's strength and success. Stories about her great-grandmother who had marched for civil rights. And stories about a brave little girl named Zariah who had stood up for a stranger because her parents had taught her that kindness was non-negotiable. She told Arya that the world was both beautiful and broken, that people could be cruel and they could be heroic, sometimes both in the same day. But that as long as there were people willing to stand up, to speak out, to demand better, there was hope for a future where children like Arya wouldn't have to fight the same battles their grandmothers had fought. Camille helped Eudora into the car, then took Arya and secured her in the car seat. Thomas climbed into the driver's seat, and they pulled out of the car park, heading into London, toward home, toward the beginning of a visit Eudora had dreamed about for 3 years. As the car merged into traffic, Eudora looked out the window at the city passing by. Somewhere in this same city, Zoraya was probably boarding her connection to Geneva, continuing her own journey. Eudora said a silent prayer for that remarkable child, asking that the world be kind to her, that her courage never be diminished, that her compassion never be exploited. And she made a promise to herself that she would write to Zoraya, would stay in touch, would be another voice reminding her that what she'd done mattered, that standing up for justice was never wasted effort even when it felt exhausting or futile. Camille reached back from the front seat and squeezed her mother's hand. She asked again if she was really okay, saying she could tell something had happened on the flight, that her mother could tell her when she was ready. Eudora squeezed back and said she would share the whole story, but not today. Today was for joy, for Arya, for family, for celebrating this reunion they'd both waited so long for. Camille accepted this, though Eudora could see the concern in her daughter's eyes reflected in the rearview mirror. She knew Camille would ask again, would want to know what had happened, would probably be furious when she heard about Grant and Elise. But that conversation could wait. Right now, Eudora just wanted to rest, to be with her family, to let the love in this car wash away the hurt from that plane. As they drove through London streets, Eudora thought about everything that had happened in the past 12 hours. The confrontation, the humiliation, Zoraya's intervention, the passengers who had finally spoken up, Derek's decisive action, Grant's removal, the apology and compensation, the goodbye at the airport. And now this, holding space for both trauma and joy, both pain and healing, both the reality of ongoing injustice and the hope that came from those willing to fight it. She was exhausted but also energized, hurt but also validated, angry at what had happened but grateful for how it had ended. And above all, she was here. She'd made it. Despite everything, she'd completed her journey and arrived at her destination. That had to count for something. That had to mean something. Subscribe if this story moved you. Like if you believe in the power of standing up for others. Do you think Eudora should have accepted the airline's compensation, or should she have pushed for more accountability?